Hi, welcome to Business Solutions in Azure Cloud. And we're going to be focusing on the testing side of the house. So I just want to do a quick recap where we left off in part one, right? So in the the first session, we actually set up a couple of things. We actually set up the environments for the following areas. We set up the APIs. We set up the application settings. We had a couple of configuration files that we set up inside of Azure Storage account. We created a container. So basically, we're trying to basically build out this architectural diagram here. And if you go to a subscription, just to do a quick recap, we created a resource group called Training 2024-11-26. Then inside of that resource group, we have a couple of resources in there. We'll go through these resources in details later on. But we had a function app out here that had a couple of endpoints, and these endpoints represents the APIs we're going to be calling later on. So we have a retrieve endpoint, we have an update endpoint, and then we do have a storage account that represents the configuration files which have in there. So if you go into a container, you have the configuration file that is in our container. So click on the container here. We have our config files, and this config files actually has the two files inside of there, which is in the documentation. And also, if you go into our storage browser here, we can actually see the table that we're going to be pushing our data into, right? So this is the table that we're going to be focusing on pushing our data out into. So for this session, we're going to be focusing on testing, right? So we're going to be using a tool called Postman to do our testing. Now, if you're not familiar with Postman, just to give you a quick introduction into Postman. So I go to Postman. You can download a version of Postman. Now, I recommend using the web version. So they give you an option of the Windows 62, 64-bit download, or you can just try the web version. The web version has more up-to-dates inside of there versus the actual one that you download on Windows. And that's what we're going to be using for our testing today. So I'm just going to pull up a use case. I already had that set up and ready to go, so we don't have to set it up manually. And I'm going to bring that into play, right? So you go to this side. And I already set it up here. When you do our configuration test case, we're going to have an upload section here. We're going to have a get patch section here. I've got some sample data we're going to be using to be testing, but we're going to do it side by side. So I want to make sure that we understand how configuration-driven development works, right? So configuration-driven development is actually done based on you setting up configuration files to actually drive execution of code, or in this case, execution of its workflow. It works similar to workflow. You add components to the workflow, it behaves differently. So I'm going to just walk you through that process. That's what makes this solution a little bit more different from typical APIs that are out there, right? So like I mentioned in the last session we have two config files. Now, each of these config files are almost like a circuit breaker, right? So you can actually turn them off and you can turn them on, and they have then is enable tag here. So we're going to turn this off. We're just going to walk through the behavior as we turn each of these on and see how it behaves along the way. So we're going to make this false. We're going to make the transformation section false. And we're going to save this. And this API key is very important because when we go into our test case, in the headers here, we actually have this XAK API key which you used in the last session, and then this key represents the connector to our config file, right? So I've already done a test in the past to make sure it's working. But we're gonna have a couple of test cases we're gonna be working with, right? So I'm gonna try to change. We're gonna change this over to 26 because this is the we have a new session here we're working on. And I'm gonna go into the body here. I'm just gonna take this out. And I'm going to browse through this and just walk you through the whole process again. So we're going to go through the steps of uploading the file. So the client is at the point now. I'm just going to use a simple test case for Winter Olympics. If you guys are into Olympics, I'm just using the winter and the summer because the file is a little smaller. And I'm going to hit send. And let's see what happens. So what did it do? It actually took my file as is. So basically it's a flat file. You didn't do nothing special here. So if you actually come out from this, select the file, go to new. I just want to show you basically the raw file content itself. Let's open it up to something like Notepad to see what's in there. So let's open this up in Notepad++. Just give an idea of what the file. So this is just basically a comma separated file. So the expectation is that a client is going to be uploading comma separated files of specific data. So they might, if you're in the retail industry, you might have some like different kind of category of clothing or genres of clothing, or depending on what kind of clothing you have. Or you might have products that have different condiments. Also, if you're selling goods or services, you have products that may have different types of condiments in terms of what you can do if you're into the food industry. So it could be used for a number of solutions basically. Yeah, but they have specific customer related information that they want to tie into a customer. That's the requirements they have. But I'm just using an example of how a CSV file would look. And that's what we uploaded here. But the problem is that when you upload this file, it's just basically spitting back the file back out in the comma separate file. So it's not doing anything with the file. It's just basically reproducing the file. The actual NoSQL database that we're planning to put this file into doesn't understand CSVs. It understands JSON. So we need to convert this file into JSON. So this is where we have to do some ETL. We have to do some transformation, and then we can load it into SQL. So if you go back to our handy config file here, we're going to start turning things on, right? So we know that this needs to get converted to a JSON. So we're going to turn that on. And we're going to save that. And we're going to go back to a handy test case, and we're going to hit send. Oops, it's not going to work because I need to choose a file. Sorry about that. Drop that file off. Let's choose a file here. So I'm going to choose this file here. Do this one more time. I'm going to hit send. And what this is doing basically, because we turned on one of the steps in the runtime engine through configuration, is actually gone ahead and converted this whole entire thing into a JSON payload. So now we're in the position. I remember there's no schemas involved there. We're in the position where we can start. The data is actually is in a place where we can actually ingest it into our NoSQL database. So this is the data that actually has been converted, and we're going to ingest that into our NoSQL database. So the next thing we're going to look at is in our config file is we're going to be able to write it to our database, and then we're going to be able to get a batch file out of that. So the way this is set up is I'm going to turn this on. I may have to do this twice, but that's fine. We'll do this. We're going to turn this on, and we're going to save this. And this is going to write into our new table, which we've created. So while that is going, we're going to just open up another window to show what the current state of our table is. So I'm going to authenticate twice. That Azure table that we built earlier in the last session. We're going to have a quick look at it. So let's go back to our view tab here. Let's go into resource groups. And let's pick our resource. And then we're going to go into our storage account here. They're going to storage browser. And we're going to look at that table. And we're going to see this in real time, how this works, right? So this is the table that we created in our last session. It should be empty. And it is empty. And then we're going to go into our API. And we're going to run this one more time. Remember, we turned on the other step to write into our database. So hopefully this should write the contents into our database because it's the step we're doing. And this is really the final step. And now we have a partition key back. But the partition key is not what we want to provide. We want to be able to provide a batch ID. So this response doesn't correspond to the business requirements. It already corresponds to our entire requirement. So because partition keys are basically generated by default, and we talked about that, these partition keys are what Microsoft generates. So you have to adhere to their schema representation in terms of how the data gets stored. So now we have data that has been stored in here. So now we have the partition key, the role key, the timestamp, and we have all the additional data that's coming from the CSV file. And we didn't have to provide schemas for this. Remember, this is the schema on read solution. So because the NoSQL database is going to read your JSON file, it's going to automatically determine what the schemas are based on the headers that are coming from your CSV. It's going to actually just propagate that into your NoSQL database without you having to do anything. So it actually allows you to get up and running as quickly as possible when you have data that you can start using. So this is clean data right now. We've actually uploaded this into our system. and we're ready to go. And then if you look at the partition key here, that represents technically your batch ID, but we want to be able to represent a batch ID in the response, right? Rather than having a partition key in the response. And this is where this last step comes in when we do some transformation of the payload response. So we turn this on. Hopefully this should work. Hit save. And then we can go back into our test case and run this one more time. Every time you upload a file, you do get a new ID that corresponds to that data. So everything is done in a snapshot. So the files are uploaded in a batch, it creates a snapshot. It's telling me that the user ID is not present. This is because there's an error in my code, which is good. So this is actually something I wanted to show. So these are some of the things that you get. So the configuration file, if it's not set up correctly, there's a built-in error mechanism that would show up and to produce errors. Now I'm going to keep this error in my notepad. I'm going to come back and revisit it. And we'll come back and revisit it later on and we'll explain to you why that is important, right? Because what can we use in Azure? That's really the key thing here. I'm going to go back and correct that problem and say user ID is not present. I know there's no user ID in my code. I don't need to use a user ID. So I need to fix this. So I wanted to get the status back, and that really is what I wanted. If we look at it and get the status. Oops, sorry. Let's undo that. So I want to get the status back. So we want the status code is what we wanted. And we wanted the count, right? We have the count, and then we have the batch ID, which is part of the partition ID. So in this case, because I mistakenly put user ID in here, I need to correct that. So I already want the status code from here, and the status code is what we want back here. So if I save this now, this is like correcting things in real time, and I go back to my code base and run this one more time. Hopefully, we should get a result set back. And that was successful. So now the client is happy. We do have 5,000 records. I won't recommend uploading that many records, but you can. So we have 5,000 records. We actually have successful. We actually have a batch ID that represents how we're going to get the data back out. So now we're going to go to the next step of how do we retrieve the data out. Well, we're creating a batch of records. We want to retrieve the data out. So this is a batch of record of Winter Olympics. So that's what we're going to check. So the next step is go to get batch records, right? So get batch records similar to this. We're going to paste this in here. We're going to go to the config file. I'm going to have a look at that, right? So the config file here, the client wants to be able to get out those records back. So this is the one that represents getting the records back from a batch. If you scroll in here, we look at the key, XAPI key represents this configuration file. So now again, the batch record is back. So we're going to pass in a statement, which should be abstracted and is abstracted away from you, which takes in the batch ID. And then we're going to actually try to call our database and we're going to get results set back. So let's just walk through this, right? So I'm going to turn everything off. So that's typically how I do. I just want to make sure we know how this works. So I make this false. I'm going to make this false. Like I said, it's a circuit breaker, right? So if you turn things off on the circuit breaker, nothing works. So if you're in a production environment and you introduce a new change or introduce a new configuration file, and you know that configuration file is not ready to use onto the next iteration, you can actually install the config files, test it locally on your machine, test it in a lower environment, and then push it out to production. And those config files can be turned off to ensure that you're not introducing any breaking changes in your code base, which where the APIs are isolated. And then obviously we have another layer of security where an XAPI key has to be provided for this endpoint to work, right? So if I disable this step in the key and I actually do a run, because there's no key, it's gonna just time out on me, right? So it's actually going and saying, oh, I'm looking for a key, and it will eventually time out. So it looks like an API is not actually working. So to hit the 30-second timer and it will eventually time out. So, and that's the thing you have to take into consideration. Every API needs an XAPI key. So if I select this, I want to make sure that I have the right batch ID. Just go here. I'm going to grab this batch, which is basically the batch ID we're trying to query for. That's probably going to fail. A couple more seconds. Let's cancel that. I think I canceled it already, but it's not canceled. Okay, I've canceled that. Then what I'm going to do is we're back in the XAPI key. We're going to pass in the batch ID, which is a new one we have. We're going to hit send here. And that's just giving me back my batch ID. Nothing special here, right? So it's actually just echoing, it's actually creating a payload request based on this. It's creating a request to send to the backend. So this is step one, is actually creating a request. So when we turn this step on, it then turns it into a query that is understood by the underlying NoSQL database, right? So if I turn this step on, it actually converts that into a partition because it doesn't understand batch IDs. It converts it into a partition for us. So there's some transformation going on even at the query, just querying the database. There's some level of transformation that's going on to make sure it's queryable. And then if I turn this on here, now this is actually going to be the step that actually retrieves the records by batch ID, right? So if I save that and go back in here, we should get some records back. So now we actually did an end-to-end. We actually uploaded the configuration file. I mean, uploaded the CSV file, and then we can now retrieve it. So the client is happy, but we have some additional information that is coming back in the response that the client is asking questions about. What's a row key? What's a partition key? And what's a timestamp, right? Why is the timestamp in there? Now, some clients prefer to have this because depending on what the client is, they might want to do individual updates of records, even though it's in an array. They might want to go back and maybe update just one record. And normally you need a primary key. In this case, is a row key to identify the record you're trying to update. So it's basically an observe, right? If we're making changes to this data. But this particular client doesn't care about that. They just want to be able to retrieve the batch ID based on the records that have been uploaded through a CSV file. So what we're going to do here is that we're going to go into this section here. I'm going to turn on the last step. So the last step here is just saying, okay, I want you to remove additional rows or additional properties that are not required, right? So you might want to extract, sorry about that, make that true, save this, and we want to hit send. And what this is going to do is going to actually allow us to pull back the same piece of data, but we've removed all the additional properties that are not needed. So there were additional properties in there. Remember, there's a partition key, row key, and a timestamp. We've extracted that. So back to the raw data that was posted and that was uploaded through a CSV, but we're actually getting the data back instead of a again the data back in JSON. So now the client is extremely happy. The client has a way to upload files, not just one file, but they're uploading the file. So obviously there's a question around what about schema? I mean, we have a schema that has a year, city, sports discipline, and we have what is athletics or general. So some clients, these clients have different schema representations of the data, right? So they have different types of CSV files they want to use it because it's a shared solution and they don't want to have to pay to build another API and they have cycle time involved in the development process. So one of the things that we've introduced in the API is we have the schemaless upload of CSV. So because it's schemaless, we're not really, and then the NoSQL database can elastically grow according to new columns that are added. One of the benefits you can do is they can upload a different schema representation. So imagine if you have a scenario where you have the Winter Olympics, which is basically one schema, and then when you want to do something else, you want to upload maybe college information, which is different from the Olympic scores. It gets very interesting. So let me pick up another piece of data here, and we can actually walk through what this is. So see what we have here. I'm just trying to figure out where I can pick up information. So look at credits. Let's look at college information. Let's try to pick one up that is small, and then we can have a look at. So this is basically a sample database of all the of universities and some additional information around the students as well as the teachers. And all this is contact information, right? So you have let me view this with no wrap. So that way you can see clearly. So you have the company address, city, state, zip code, county, phone number, website, contacts, all the remaining things here. But this is a different header. So you can imagine we just uploaded Winter Olympics. Now we're going to upload a different CSV that has a different schema representation. So how do we accomplish that? We can actually do the same thing here, right? So we can take this file as is, no changes to it. We're going to open this one. I'm going to upload this one into our backend system. So I hit save. We should get a different count. Give it a couple of seconds because that's the save you and parsing and write to a database. So now we have this one is a little bit bigger. We have roughly 10,000 records. Like I recommend keep your batch sizes low because uploading them takes time, and also querying database sometimes takes about a couple of seconds. So if you have a high performing system, you want to make sure that your the batches that you upload are within a certain amount. Also, keep them under 1,000. But this is a demo. I'm actually trying to stretch the data sets limits. So this is a 10,000 record data set. Now, remember we had a batch record previously, which is this. I'm going to keep this to the side and I'm open up a notepad. Just keeping track of everything here. So these are the failures. We're gonna come to that later on and we'll check that. And then here's the actual first retrieval that we did. We'll go back to our upload, grab the next batch ID, go back to our get batch, take note of the response that comes here. We're going to change that. We're going to put the new batch ID in here. I'm going to hit send. And what this should do is to actually go in and retrieve the new batch of records we have. So there's some level of isolation. So a batch ID is a way of separating one record from another record. So this came back in 2 seconds, but you can see the amount of data that's come back. And it also removed the timestamp, the partition key, as well as the row key. That's not needed. But we know is that the data here is represented different. It's a different kind of schema representation of that data. So we have a complete isolation of schema representation of data. So the batch doesn't only allow you to upload different CSV files, but it also allows you to actually upload to actually retrieve the batch IDs, and you have different schema representations. So if you convert that into configuration management tools, we normally think about different applications that may have shared systems and using your API, and they may have different key value pairs they want to store, either as in a single array or multiple arrays of information. And this allows you to do a lot more things. That's how powerful this is. It gives you a lot of flexibility to do a lot more. So in the third session, we're going to talk about how do we track all these changes we're making? How do we make sure our API is working as expected? So what happens when you have an exception in our APIs? What do we use to monitor all these things? That's something we can talk about in the next session. So hopefully you join me in the next session. And as our final session, we're going to be talking about application insights. Thank you very much.